are governments supposed to have the same level of culpability or approach ethics in the same way at all as individuals? Because we seem to be assuming that the parable of the Good Samaritan, let's say, that applies to governments as much as it applies to individuals. I don't know that that's actually true. I think governments are a fundamentally different entity. And so while individuals have this ordo amoris, does the ordo amoris, yes, you can order your ideas of protection and what's necessary, but what makes up governmental ethics as opposed to individual ethics? Is there a fundamental misunderstanding that those two things are actually differences of kind as opposed to differences of degree?
I would tend to think of them not necessarily as differences of kind. I think that God's created order, ethics is ethics, but there are different offices within God's ethical framework. And so government does have special duties, special obligations put on it. Now, that's not saying that government has to be intrinsically a Christian government necessarily, but government as a creation ordering has obligations that are just part of the natural world, part of the natural law, if you will say. And so in Romans 13, when Paul is kind of laying some of this out, like we are to be subject to the governing authorities, Christ says in Matthew that render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. And that's not a difference in kind necessarily, but it is a difference in office. Caesar has some legitimate authority. Governments are there to maintain order. As Romans 13 says, punish the evil and protect the good.
Yeah, that's the IRS you were talking about on the other one.
I was going to say governments too often do the reverse, right? So, but Romans 13 says, do what is good, right? And you will receive approval. Rulers don't hold terror for good conduct, right? That they punish the bad conduct. They wield the sword to punish the wickedness, right? And so that's part of the office, the role of government. But as I said, not a difference in kind, but a difference in the responsibilities. And so, I mean, governments aren't great at loving in the ways that individuals or families are. But it is a sort of love to respect God's created order and to fulfill its obligations the way it was meant to.
So in this discussion, I think when we talk about render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God, I think a good question to ask would be, I think the real question in the midst of this is that who decides as to what Caesar should get? And even with Romans 13, when we talk about the deacon of God, the civil magistrate who wields the sword of justice, the question is, whose sword is he wielding? Who is the one who defines the jurisdiction within which the state should remain or the civil magistrate should remain? I think that's a question. That's the main question behind the question of the fact that the civil magistrate is required to do certain duties towards the citizens. And so, unless and until we tackle that very question and recognize that, and the challenge is, why would someone who's not a Christian would accept the fact that that the sword belongs to God? That's where the tension is. But as Christians, as we understand it, I think we have a responsibility towards informing the civil magistrate as to what that sword looks like and who ultimately owns that sword.
So let's talk about a couple of issues that are really important here, because sometimes an action can seem to be virtuous, but it has a detrimental effect. For example, let's look at something like welfare policy, or no, let me use something that's a little bit less controversial. Let's talk about, say, Christians who, and this is very common in the United States, where they will have summer short-term missions outreaches. So they'll take a group of folks at your church and say, this summer we're going to spend 2 weeks going to Haiti. We're going to help build a church. Have local guys there that are going to help build a church, and we're going to pass out some clothes that we're bringing along and things like that. These feel like virtuous entities. But if you talk with individuals who are, say, long-term missionaries, people who are embedded, and this happens in West African nations and other places as well. If you do this, what you find happens is that there are so many people doing short-term mission trips to Haiti that the guy who lives in Haiti, who wants to be a construction worker, can't get any work because all the Christians are coming down there and building all the houses and building all the churches for free. So why in the world would I hire the general contractor who's a local guy to come in and do this? Why do I set up a retail shop when everybody's giving clothes away for free? Now, what happens is you're setting up a system of dependency. And although you mean well, you're actually helping to perpetuate the poverty so that you can never have the individuals in Haiti establish their own economy and raise themselves out of it. This is how a lot of governmental programs work. Instead of the traditional understanding of Christians giving of themselves to hospital, services, to giving personally out of their own largesse to support missionary efforts, they say, well, we're going to tax all of you people. And as a government, we are going to take your money and we will decide how it's charitably distributed. So I don't have to worry about feeding the woman on the street because she has the SNAP program and she has all these other things. But what that does is ultimately, doesn't that cripple her and make her now dependent upon the government, whereas she never has the opportunity to rise above it? So this is one of the tension points where even something, it's not that you're trying to be malicious. It's not that it's, feeding people isn't a good thing. Going on missions isn't a good thing. But sometimes there's fallout from that can be actually more detrimental than the other thing. And one of the biggest problems I've seen in the United States today is far, far fewer people give to some of these programs because they believe the government should do it, right? Oh, there were the wildfires that happened in Southern California. Of course, the federal government's going to come in and give relief to all these people. We're at the point now where it's a knee-jerk reaction. The government should have been the one to help all those folks. Where's the government at? Well, that's not been what traditionally had happened over the last few centuries. So I think that there's a big red flag there in assuming that the government can do the things in the way that individuals can do it because the dynamics are different, right? You don't get to choose to give or not to give. Individually, the taxes come out.
Yeah.
And so that's a big problem. And I think that robs us as individuals of something. It makes an artificial dependence upon the government, secondly. And thirdly, it doesn't allow you to discriminate. And everybody knows that private organizations are much more efficient, even at distributing food to the poor and things like that, than the government ever would be.